All right, let's begin. So although the oldest extant Chinese wooden pagoda is from the 11th century, this one, we know that there were many much earlier wooden pagodas existed. How did we know that? because there were historical records. There were also visual materials that were carved in stone and casted in bronze and painted on the wall. So on the right is a pagoda that served as a central pillar for a rock-cut temple. In India, there had been a long history of rock-cut space for meditation, for religious practice. On the left is a Chaitya hall at Ajanta. Chaitya hall is in India was an interior worshiping space. The center is a stupa, and worshiping rituals took the form of circumambulation, right? So people just walk around the sacred center, which was the relics of Buddha. And when Buddhism was introduced to China, same practice was adopted, but the central kind of circumambulation center became the pagoda. So this is a rock-cut cave from the Yungang cave from the 5th century. And it is a pagoda, in the form of a 5-story pagoda that served as the central pillar for the cave. So this is like a Chinese Chaitya hall. And unmistakably, the pagoda, even though carved in stone, it was meant to mimic a wooden structure. The column, beam, brackets, and a tiled roof supported by wooden members like purlins and rafters. All those details were carved on the surface. So we knew by the 5th century, wooden pagoda had been constructed and mimicked in those rock-cut temples. And there were also, of course, historical documents about the construction of wooden pagoda in the 5th century and before. So last time we talked about the Sinusization of the stupa into pagoda. There was also a Sinusization of Buddhist monastery in general. So The Chinese craftsmen understandably, used the material and the technology they were comfortable with for the construction of Buddhist temples. So they built wooden halls and using sloping roofs and building corridors to define courtyards. So this kind of courtyards plan became a signature of Chinese Buddhist architecture. Like, as I mentioned, like in India, the early Buddhist practice took the relics worship at the main form of their kind of daily activity. So early Buddhist monastery plans features this kind of pagoda-centered plan. So in the middle is a pagoda, and a corridor surrounded, and some rooms of that corridor were closed up with doors to provide residential space for the monks and the practitioners. So we have this plan featuring this memorial and worship space, and the worship took place in the courtyard. So the circumambulation would took place in the courtyard. Later, like in Central Asia, the Gandhara area, where the worship of icon developed, gradually worshiping for Buddha shifted from the relics to the image, to a statue or a painted image. So that happened first in the Central Asian part of the Indian sphere, that is today's Pakistan and Afghanistan, that area known as the Gandhara region, which is the place where the first Buddhist statue was created. So Buddhists start to worship the icon. So before that, Buddhists were also uniconic. They worship those symbolic form representing Buddha, like the relics, like his footprint, like a tree that symbolize the Buddhist enlightenment, because Buddha seated under a tree and became enlightened, suddenly awakened. So that shift happened in India, and that shift also happened in China, probably because the transfer of Buddhist practice from India to China, it took some times for the missionary to travel. So those earlier arrived took a earlier form of Indian practice, and then later arrived spreading the newer fashion. So so that represent a old monastery plan featuring a pagoda in the center. But the more popular plan in Chinese Buddhism is not pagoda centered, but something like this. There is a building with Buddhist image, a statue usually, and then there is also a lecture hall called 讲堂. And this is the primary form of Buddhist practice in China, worshiping the image of Buddha, often a statue, and also giving lectures on the Buddhist sutras, that is Buddhist classics. So image hall at lecture hall, known as the 法堂 and 讲堂. So 法堂 is the Dharma hall. Dharma is the Buddhist law, and law in Buddhist culture means principle of the universe, not just governing the human society. So in Chinese Buddhist monastery, from a very early time, from the Age of Disunion, the Fa Tang and Jiang Tang, that is the image hall and the lecture hall, took the central place. And very often, the pagoda is either put in the back of the monastery or appear in a pair outside the central location, framing the central courtyard. So those are usually the location of pagoda. In Chinese Buddhist monastery. And then, surrounded by a corridor, some of those rooms became the cells for practitioners. And we also know from historical record that in the Age of Disunion, powerful rulers and rich merchants donate their residence to serve as a Buddhist monastery. And conversion of dwelling into monastery, 舍宅为寺, was widely practiced. A result of the belief that donation to Buddhist monastery would help to accumulate good karma. Karma means, retribution. Basically, you do good thing in this life, and you will be retributed with, spiritual benefit in your next life. So that's called karma. That kind of karmic retribution means, the result is not only during your lifetime, because according to Buddhism, everyone live numerous lives until one achieve nirvana and became an enlightened one. So before that, life is like clothes. You take on one and shed off when one die, and then take on another. That kind of rebirth and reincarnation is endless and painful. So in order to get out of that cycle of life, one needed to become enlightened and to achieve eternal life and happiness. So that's another reason why Chinese Buddhist monastery kind of looks very similar to residential architecture, because a lot of monasteries were converted from residential compound. And indeed, in Chinese architecture, the function or religion of a building complex can be hardly told apart unless you go inside to see what was being worshipped. And that was a characteristic of Chinese architecture as well. So they basically use the same building, but they use courtyard to define different space, but basically use the same unit for different religion, different function. For example, this is a memorial shrine for Gao Huan. Gao Huan was the ruler of a northern regime called Beiqi, or the Northern Qi, which is one of the many kingdoms in North China during the Age of Disunion. So his memorial shrine looks pretty much like a residence. It has a double layer of courtyards, like a mini city, cardinally oriented with the gates on the 4 cardinal direction, and then the inner circle enclose a memorial hall, the major shrine. So, so in China, before Buddhism was popularized, religious and memorial architecture already took the style and form of a residential architecture. So it's very easy. It's not a difficulty to convert a residence to a monastery at all. And so all you need to do is to build a pagoda in the courtyard, or to the back of the courtyard, or to the side of the courtyard, and to substitute the images of ancestor in the hall with the images of a Buddha. Northern Wei is another kind of regime in North China during this period. But Northern Wei is more influential because it unified the entire Yellow River region. And Northern Wei was also, quite powerful. Territory was big, and more importantly, the rulers of the Northern Wei, even before they conquer North China, they were already Buddhists. So they helped to popularize Buddhism in North China. And their city, this is the reconstructed drawing of the Northern Wei, Luoyang, the capital city of Northern Wei, in the 6th century, from the late 5th century to the middle of the 6th century. And the city featured many pagodas, and a whole book was published just to discuss the Buddhist monasteries in the city of Luoyang. That book called Luoyang Qielan Ji, the record of Buddhist monasteries in the city of Luoyang. So, and many Buddhist monasteries were recorded in that book, and it especially mentioned a monastery called Yongning Si, or the Yongning Monastery, the monastery of eternal peace. So that in that book, it talks about the pagoda of Yongning Si. And he talked about that the pagoda was 1,000 feet high. And when the bronze bell hanging from its eaves rang, it could be heard from hundreds of miles away. That might be an exaggeration. It went on and on, talk about how beautiful it was. It was sponsored by the Empress Dowager Hu. But unfortunately, only a few years of its construction, it was burned in a fire. And that burning went on for 3 months. So, we have long been questioning such record, just like we have been questioning the record by Sima Qian about the tomb for the first emperor, whether the scale, the beauty, the grandeur of those great architecture from the past were simply imagination, exaggeration. But archaeologists always confirm the historical record. Archaeology always proves true. Those grandeur, those scale were actually quite accurate. In the 20th century, the footprint of Yongning-si was discovered and excavated. Yongning-si Monastery, this one, in the city of Luoyang. All right, it's very close to the palace. Of course, the Empress Dowager would choose a place near home to worship. So this is the palace of Northern Wei, period. And this is the inner city. And this is Yongning-si. It is just to the west side of the Central Avenue, where all the major religious administration compounds concentrated within the inner center, inner city, and outside the city, a series of ritual architecture concentrated in the southern part. So it's part of the kind of ritual governmental access for the Northern Wei city of Luoyang. There, archaeologists discovered a base 150 feet square. So the record of the Luoyang temples talk about in quite some detail about Yongning-si. It talk about it has 9-story. It has 100 feet. It was 100 feet above ground. I'm sorry. The base, the 140 feet square base was from another very important building from another book from the Age of Disunion called Commentary on the Water Classics, 水经注, not actual archaeological data. But archaeologists discovered the footprint of the Yongning-si Yongning-si Pagoda. The actual measures, the base is 38.2 meter square, which is about the English feet 125.3, and which is about 140 Wei feet. So the Wei dynasty, their foot was a little bit shorter than the current English foot. So that's quite accurate, actually. The historical record, we're not exaggerating, we're not, they were pretty recording the truth. Of course, the height, there is no archaeological record because, of course, only the footprint of the pagoda survived. However, archaeologists, based on the proportion a pagoda need to have, and if you believe the record of Luoyang Temple, it has 9 stories, and it should be 1,000 Wei feet. That is quite possible, which should equal 895 British feet, and that is 272.8 meters. That's taller than most modern high rises, right? So it was a great architecture. Archaeologists also discovered much detail from this footprint. For example, they discovered there is a rammed earth core. Pagoda features a concentric plan with an earth core for the ground floor, surrounded by an inner kind of circumambulation route, and then surrounded by another layers of corridor or outer circumambulation route. So it has this kind of double shell structure. And this is a reconstruction of the section drawing of the reconstruction. And this scholar thought that the earth core might go as high as the 7th floor. So that means for floors 1 to 7, the wooden structures were constructed attaching to a rammed earth tower. This is pretty much like the pre-Han Dynasty high platform architecture, right? 台榭. For that, the 台榭prototype. Combining earth with wood, using rammed earth platform to elevate the profile of a significant building. And the top 2 floors are pure wooden construction. And the scholars also found, pits inside this earth core, which might indicate that to strengthen the earth core, the earth were not only rammed, but also consolidated by kind of a wooden framework. And the previous image was a perspective drawing from outside. So from outside, it seems it is a great architecture and a lot of interior space, but in reality, the interior has an earth core up to the 7th floor. If we agree with this specific scholar. This is a reconstruction by Fujinyen. A reading chapters from his book are assigned for you to read. So you might be able to recognize his last name, Fu. His reconstruction. So a grand architecture, great height, great scale was achieved by the combination of rammed earth with wooden construction. So, I'm just going to very quickly show you a series of Japanese architecture. Why do I show Japanese architecture in a class on Chinese architecture? That is because the Japanese were more good at protecting their old buildings, and wooden structure survived in Japan from a much earlier age than in China. The oldest wooden building in China was from the year 781. The oldest building from Japan was from 607, with a reconstruction from 710. So we know pretty sure that that building, the design was from the 7th century, so at least a century before the extant Chinese wooden structure. We also knew that the Japanese had been copying Chinese architecture since the Age of Disunion and to the following Sui dynasty and Tang dynasty. So I'm going to show you very quickly, because this is not a class on Japanese architecture, but that parallel shows much more clearly. While in China, we rely on archaeology to recover those buildings from the Age of Disunion, Japanese architecture from the 7th century, 8th century, they were kind of copying an earlier architectural style of the Chinese Age of Disunion. And that series of monastery from Japan shows a change from the pagoda-centered monastery plan to a image hall-centered monastery plan. So in fact, much reconstruction of architectural history in China from that early Buddhist age was also kind of a you have to look at Japan in the study of early Chinese architecture, because it's simply survived better. This is Azuka Della in Japan. So all what I need to point out is it has a pagoda in the center. All right, so this represents an early monastery type, the archaic plan, surrounded by 3 image hall. So this is unmistakably pagoda centered. And this one is from the 6th century. Slightly later, Shintenoji had a pagoda and an image hall located in the central courtyard. All right, and this is a reconstruction based on the archaeological site. A pagoda, both the pagoda and the image hall are located in the central courtyard. The 2 framing structure are not pagodas. These are the belfry, the bell tower, and the sutra reposit, the kind of Buddhist library, and residential quarters is in the back. And this is Holyji. Holyji has the oldest wooden structure, whose design came from the year 607, and it was burned and then rebuilt in 711. So this one also has a pagoda and an image hall or a Buddha hall in the central courtyard. But now they are both not on the central axis, but framing the central axis on either side. And behind it is the lecture hall, right? So a pagoda, an image hall, and the lecture hall. Actually, when the Chinese archaeologists, reconstruct Northern Wei or earlier Chinese Buddhist monastery, they made reference. They made a lot of reference to this building because this is the oldest standing building representing a kind of early East Asian style Buddhist monastery. In Japan, it is from the Ashoka period, which is widely recognized as taking the Northern Wei Chinese style architecture. So for those ones, this is the plan of Holyji, corridor surrounding pagoda, kondo, Japanese term for the image hall. And but then yeah, this is the pagoda from Holyji, and it's Ashoka period Japan, but representing a northern and southern dynasty Chinese architecture. Northern and southern dynasty was the second half of the Age of Disunion. The first half was called the Eastern Jin, and the period of Eastern Jin and 16 kingdoms. 5-story, right? Odd number of story, using a tower pavilion type. So a lot of brackets and overreaching eaves, and then the axis on the top represent the axis of the universe. And the double core that served as create a circumambulation space. And in Japan, this building had no earth core anymore. But in the center is a group of statue. And like in India, the function of the East Asian pagoda was to honor and bury the relics of Buddha. And in Japan, in Holyji, that was directly underground under this central axis. And this is a detail of that. There is a pit under the central column, and buried under the platform. This is the main image hall of Holyji, the oldest wooden building in the whole world. And then next, in the Japanese theory, the Yakushiji, the monastery for the medicine Buddha, pagodas lost their central location. So the image hall occupied the center of the courtyard. And this is the lecture hall. And the two pagodas are located on either side of the central axis. And this is what it looks today. Two pagodas framing the central axis. So the shift is kind of complete from a pagoda-centered plan to an image hall-centered plan. And this is Kofukuchi. So in Japan, there are more buildings from the 7th century, 8th century survived much more than in China. Kofukuchi also, had another kind of interesting monastery plan where it features central courtyard and side courtyards as well. The central courtyard, there's an image hall, and then there's a corridor. But then on the side courtyard, there's an image hall, and there's a pagoda. This is the lecture hall. And a symmetrical courtyard is located on the west side. Today, only the platform of the west image hall survived. And the scholar believe there used to be a Western pagoda there as well. And finally, Todaiji from the mid 8th century in Japan made an emphasis on the image hall most clearly and most powerfully. This is the image hall. It is big, right? It's huge. This is Todaiji, sponsored by Emperor Shomu. And so located in the central courtyard, we have this image hall, we have the lecture hall, and then there is the gate. The pagodas are located on the two sides, outside the central courtyard. Today, none of those pagodas stand, but the image hall survived the more than 1,000 years, and it is the largest wooden building in the world from the ancient time. That's the a reconstruction drawing of the Todaiji, showing the the image hall, 2 pagodas, and the lecture hall. So this is what it looked today. The Daibutsudan for Todaiji, and Daibutsudan means the hall of great Buddha, because there is a gigantic bronze Buddha inside. The bronze statue was cast first, and then the building was constructed around it. Because the Buddha was so big, there's no way to build a building and put it in. So to some extent, the architecture was a pendant to the statue. The building, its dimension, its height. So this is an enormous building. And so, by tracing this development from the late 7th century, to the mid 8th century in Japan, we can trace very clearly how in East Asia, China, Japan, and Korea included a monastery plan evolved from a pagoda-centered plan to an image hall-centered plan. And we don't have such a nicely arranged lineage standing on earth in China. So we have to look at Japanese architecture to get a feeling of this kind of a planning change. But in China, much older rock-cut temples survived. They were carved in stone, so they survived. And we knew that the Japanese learned from the Chinese Also because a lot of those wooden structure from 7th century Japan looks pretty much like a 5th century Chinese architecture as carved in stone. So this is the same cave from Yungang we looked at earlier, the 5-story pagoda from the late 5th to early 6th century, from the Northern Way cave at Yungang. Yungang is a location. It features a series of caves carved into the mountain side, and each of those caves mimic a wooden hall in interior at the facade. And here we have this pagoda, and it is obviously a 楼阁式塔, the tower pavilion pagoda. And it looked very much like the 5-story pagoda from Holyji in Japan. And when Professor Fujinyen reconstructed his drawing for Yongning-si Pagoda, he also referred to this very much, right? So he relied on images like this for the reconstruction of the upper stories for those vanished buildings in China. And to remind you that the central pillared cave is a copy spatially of a Indian Chaitya hall. So Yungang Cave, it features a series of caves carved to the mountainside, and they have Buddha carved in it to be worshipped. They used to have wooden facade constructed in front of them. But today, most of those wooden structures disappeared, and those Buddha got exposed. But they used to be called a temple as well. To some extent, these rock-cut caves are the back part of a temple. Kind of also indicate where the idea of the Daibutsudan in Japan came from, right? You have a huge Buddha seated inside a building. The building could be carved in stone. The building could be constructed purely in wood. This is cave number 20, the largest cave from Yungang. And Yungang is a Northern Way site. So all those caves were built in a very short time from the late, about 3 decades, from the late 5th century to the early 6th century. And the interior had rich material for the study and the reconstruction of early Chinese architecture, because the carving of the interior mimic the interior of a wooden hall. And they also provide a lot of detail, architectural detail, for example, a Chinese roof, and pagoda. So here we have a pagoda-like pillar supporting a sloping roof with the brackets making the transition. And the roof is curved with ridge decoration on the top. We got a lot of details. From the details like this, we know the Chinese sometimes adopt the Indian kind of Chaitya window for decoration. like this kind of shape. And here as well, kind of semicircular in the kind of teardrop shape, a characteristic window shape from India, which appeared as early as the 2nd century CE in India, and provide details about the roof. The roof has tiles, right? It's mimicked in stone, and the brackets were pretty much parallel to the wall, without much protrusion, without much cantilever. This is the feature of early brackets. And there were also inverted V shape in between the brackets. We can also see that there are 2 sets of rafters, not just 1 layer, but 2 sets under the eave. Ceramic tile, and that roof decoration is called the owl's tail. It also suggests that traditional Chinese architecture were kind of painted, but this kind of bright color came from much later date. The color is not original from the 5th century. This is another detail. This is an entrance to a cave at Yungang. Here it offered a detail of 5th century, 6th century Chinese architecture carved in stone, and we find the very similar characteristic, and you can see all those details. All right, owl's tail, tiles, brackets, inverted V shape, and probably the front of the building was also decorated with all those decoration. Could be in textile. As you can see, the detail here had a strong sense of textile decoration feature, which were also carved in stone. Another northern way cave site in China is the Mount Maiji, Maiji Shiku, Mount Maiji cave. So here, different from Yungang, where the caves were carved along a river, arranged pretty much on the same level, at Mount Maiji, all those temples piled up, arranged vertically along a mountainside. So there were, one temple above the other. So they were arranged like that, the caves. So one needs to have steps, staircases, zigzagging staircases to have access to those upper temples. They also offered architectural details. So I'm showing you those original materials on which scholars like Fujinyen rely on for their reconstruction of early Chinese architectural history. This is one of the cave number 30 at Mount Maiji. It shows a very kind of clear facade of wooden construction. I don't want to repeat those same information as shown from earlier ones, but I do want to point out this very interesting column. And this is the column in situ. I pointed out because it looks so much similar to Greek architecture, the Greek orders, the Doric capital. And the prototype of Doric in Greek architecture from Egypt, in Egyptian architecture, from the mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut. There was also column, looks very similar to this, with abacus and with kind of a shaft. The ages are very different. Queen Hatshepsut ruled in the before 1000 BCE. 1000 BCE, and the Greeks 5th century BCE, and here 5th century CE. So they are vastly different in terms of age, but they bear great similarity. So I'm just pointing out the fact. I'm not suggesting anything because I don't have proof about, who influenced whom. And archaeologists, based on that, made a reconstruction of this. So the cave mimic a 7-bay wooden hall, right? 7-bay, each one has a statue of Buddha. And here they were divided by wall, but if it was a wooden construction, there needn't to be a wall, right? So, and you might further, based on this, the plan of the cave, to have a educated guess of what a wooden building from the 5th century China might look like. And this image shows the location of that, and also the piled up caves at Mount Maiji. And here we have, again, the largest Buddha is right here. Another source, important source for Northern Wei architecture is from Dunhuang. And Dunhuang is also a Buddhist cave, but here all the architectural images are in painting, not in carving. They give us information not only about architectural images and details, but also about the spatial layout for Buddhist interior from the Northern Wei period and even earlier. It also shows further Sinicization of Buddhist architecture. So this cave from Dunhuang, for example, shows very clearly the interior exposed the rafters with ceilings decorated, and under the roof, painted Buddha grace the border, and a larger Buddhist imagery cover the wall. And images like that offered information on a gate-like structure from Northern Wei period. And they features those kind of owl tail decoration on the roof. And sometimes those images record a complex, like here. Looks like a tower, wooden tower elevated on masonry platform, probably rammed earth at core and surfaced with bricks, and a 6th century city gate might look like that. And we also have images of early pagodas, like this one, pagoda from the 6th century. And it does look very much like the prototype of stupa in India, rather than the later Chinese pagoda, right? So we can explore those images painted on the wall, carved in stone, to get information about early Chinese architecture that had been lost since then. So today there's no building look like this standing anymore, but it might indicate that kind of pagoda closer to the Indian stupa had been constructed on the Chinese soil. Another source for Age of Disunion architecture, and in this case, not necessarily Buddhist, was from the tomb. And like earlier Chinese, the Age of Disunion Chinese also put utensils in the tomb to serve the afterlife of their ancestors. And sometimes those jars bear a lid, and on that lid, fantastic architecture was sculpted, featuring multi-story building. And these are pretty much like the Han Dynasty tower buried in tomb. And you very often find musicians playing music on different story of those ceramic models buried in tomb. Those are pretty much from North China during the Age of Disunion. South China, Buddhism was equally popular, but caves didn't survive from that early age. Rock cut architecture started a little bit later in southern China, but there some funeral architectural sites provide material for the study of architecture as well. For example, this is a memorial column at a tomb complex from the Northern Qi dynasty, and it bear a kind of a house model on top of a column, and that house shows great detail the construction of a wooden hall from the 6th century, right? Columns and column support beams, and the upper structures, and then there are rafters. So there should be purlins, which is not visible from this end, and then the rafters, curved roofs, and covered by tiles. And these are the tile end for the convex tile, and there were also concaved tile. So the idea, even though this is a funeral site, not directly related to Buddhism, the idea of using column for memorial purposes might have been inspired by the Indian column. This is the Ashoka column in India from 3rd century BCE. There, the Indians put a big column, monolithic column, just one piece of stone, and raised a sculpture of a horse or lion or a bull, and then the lotus flower making the transition. The Indian idea came from the Persians. You might have seen something very similar to this from Persepolis in Persia, from the 6th century BCE. And so from Persia to India to China. So very far away, but when you study architectural history, you notice the ancient world, different civilizations were very much connected. Ideas can be transplanted from one location to the other. They bear similarity. They also each adopt the idea for their own purposes. And in that sense, they enriched the world with their own contribution.